Just imagine, for a moment, the entire world holding its breath. After 4 long, brutal years of war, the guns finally go silent. But, the end of the fighting? That was just the beginning of an even bigger challenge, trying to build a peace that would actually last. So let's dive into the incredible story of how the winners of World War I tried to piece Europe back together.
So in November 1918, that was it. An armistice was signed and all the fighting finally stopped. You can just imagine the incredible relief from millions of people. But the world that came out of those trenches, well, it was completely and fundamentally broken.
And this number. This is why. 9 million soldiers dead. Just let that sink in. This staggering figure just haunted every single conversation at the peace talks. It was a constant reminder of the catastrophic cost of the war, and it fueled this desperate, all-consuming need to make sure this could never, ever happen again.
Right, so the goal was to create a peace so perfect it would end all wars, forever. The problem? Europe was an absolute mess. This wasn't just about signing some piece of paper. It was about trying to rebuild an entire continent from the ashes.
I mean, just look at the state of things. The old world had literally crumbled. In Germany, the emperor was gone, booted out by a revolution. The huge Austro-Hungarian Empire, it had just collapsed, shattering into a bunch of smaller countries. And even the winners, Britain and France, were economically crippled. And then, way over on the other side of the Atlantic, the USA had suddenly become the world's new economic and military superpower. The entire balance of power had been turned on its head.
So that's the backdrop for what happens in January 1919 in Paris. The leaders of the winning countries all get together to decide Germany's fate, and really the future of Europe. But as we're about to see, they had very, very different ideas about how to do that. At the very center of all this were the big three, the leaders of the USA, Britain, and France. Now, you got to remember, these guys weren't kings. They were elected leaders. They had to go back home and face their people. And the public, especially in France and Britain, where the losses were just unimaginable, was screaming for Germany to be punished and punished harshly.
And this really breaks down their clashing personalities perfectly. You had Woodrow Wilson from the USA, the great idealist, dreaming of a better world. Then there was George Clemenceau of France, the tough-as-nails realist. And finally, David Lloyd George from Britain, the pragmatist, just trying to find some kind of compromise. 3 men with 3 totally different visions for what peace should look like. President Wilson, he was thinking big picture. He showed up with his famous 14 points, which was basically his blueprint for a new world order. He dreamed of a League of Nations where countries could talk out their problems instead of going to war. He was pushing this radical idea of self-determination, that people should get to rule themselves. And he honestly believed that if Germany became a healthy democracy, it would never cause another war. Clemenceau's vision, though, it was forged in pure survival. He had seen Germany invade his country twice in his own lifetime. France had lost 1.7 million people. He was under immense pressure back home for revenge, and more than anything, security. His goal was brutally simple: cripple Germany, take away the army, force it to pay for every bit of damage, and, if he could, break it into smaller, weaker states so it could never, ever threaten France again. And then you've got Lloyd George, caught right in the middle. See, he had just won an election promising to make Germany pay, but he was also a pragmatist. He knew that Britain actually needed a recovered Germany to trade with. He also saw a strong Germany as a useful wall against the spread of communism coming out of Russia. He was trying to thread this impossible needle between what the public wanted and what he thought was smart long-term policy. So what happens when you throw these 3 powerful, conflicting visions into a room? Well, you get a messy, difficult, and deeply controversial compromise. It was called the Treaty of Versailles. And before we even get into the details of the treaty, you have to understand this one German word, Diktat. It means a dictated peace. The Germans had 0 say in any of the negotiations. They were just handed this massive document and told, sign it or we invade. That feeling of a forced, humiliating peace would end up poisoning everything that came next. Okay, so the treaty itself was basically built on 5 main pillars. Let's walk through each one, because every single one landed like a sledgehammer blow on Germany. First up, the War Guilt Clause. This forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for starting the entire war. For Germans, this was an absolute national humiliation. It gave birth to the incredibly dangerous and totally false stab-in-the-back myth. This idea that the German army hadn't really lost the war but was betrayed by its own politicians who signed the treaty.
Second, reparations. This was the actual bill Germany was ordered to pay for war damages. 6.6 billion pounds. Now, today, that's a lot of money, but back then, it was an astronomical, unthinkable sum that its shattered economy had absolutely no realistic way of ever paying back.
And this led directly to economic catastrophe. To try and make the payments, the German government just started printing tons and tons of money. The result was hyperinflation. The German currency became so worthless that people were literally taking wheelbarrows full of cash to the store just to buy a loaf of bread. Ordinary people saw their life savings wiped out practically overnight. It created unbelievable hardship and incredible anger.
Third, they literally started carving up Germany's territory. It lost key industrial areas, all of its overseas colonies, and a huge chunk of its population. They gave land to the new country of Poland, creating what became known as the Polish Corridor, which actually split Germany into two separate pieces. It was a massive blow to Germany's economy, its power, and its pride.
And fourth, its military was completely gutted. The army was shrunk down to a tiny force of just 100,000 men. The Navy was cut to almost nothing. They were forbidden from having an air force, any tanks, or any submarines. And the Rhineland, its industrial heartland right on the border with France, was turned into a demilitarized zone. Germany was left feeling totally powerless and vulnerable. But here's the thing, the treaties weren't just about punishing Germany. They completely redrew the map of Central and Eastern Europe, creating a brand new landscape full of new nations and new tensions. You can really see that change here. The old empires were just gone. Following President Wilson's idea of self-determination, all these new countries were born from the rubble. Nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia appeared on the map for the very first time. Now, for many people, this was a moment of incredible hope, but it also created a lot of instability. But here's where it got really hypocritical. While self-determination was a great idea for the Poles and the Czechs, it was denied to the Germans. The treaty specifically banned Germany from uniting with the new, small, German-speaking nation of Austria. This forbidden union, called Anschluss, felt deeply unfair and became another major source of bitterness for Germany. So you've got all of this punishment, this resentment, this uncertainty bubbling up. But there was one great hope for the future, and that was President Wilson's passion project, the League of Nations. It was designed to keep the peace through what was called collective security. But in reality, the League's record in the 1920s was pretty mixed. As you can see, it had some real successes, solving disputes between smaller nations. But when a big power decided to throw its weight around, the League completely failed. When Italy's dictator Mussolini just invaded the Greek island of Corfu, the League was pretty much powerless to stop him. And the craziest part? The USA, whose president came up with the whole idea, never even joined. The League was undermined from the very beginning. Which brings us to the big, crucial question. The peacemakers who gathered in Paris had this incredibly noble goal of ending all wars for good. They made a treaty that punished Germany, redrew the map of Europe, and created a new body for international peace. But in trying to build a perfect peace to end one war, did they accidentally sow the seeds for an even more terrible one just a generation later?